All right, let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining us today. It's great to see you. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We will be recording today's session and we'll make it available both on our product makers community as well as on YouTube kind of a few days after the event. You can look for our recap within the in case you missed it section on our homepage, and also attached to the event for today's session in case you're looking for it. Q&A we'll be utilizing for questions at the end of the event, but feel free to ask at any point during the event, and we'll make sure we incorporate those as we get towards the end. Chat for chat if you want to use any banter between this overall, but keep in mind we may not be looking at that too much during today's session overall on that end. I'm super happy to have Joe Widawski joining us today for this little fireside chat on building a learning muscle in your product team. Joe, if you don't know him, is a veteran product designer and former UX teacher, now a co-founder at Maze, which is a product research platform that enables companies of all sizes to test and learn rapidly. And really excited to have you here today, Joe. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Scott. Very happy to be here. Very excited to talk to this very diverse bunch today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So I'm going to jump in with maybe a first little easy question here, and that's just tell me a little bit about you, your background, and what led you to get into this whole space.
No, not actually the easiest question. So no. Come from a product background. I've been in product my whole life. The reality is, I think I was building terrible websites for the world when I was 10 years old. So it's been kind of always a passion of mine to build products. Afterwards, I was a UX and development teacher. So I've always seen both these functions as means to create great products. So it was always a passion of mine to build great products and learn the means to actually create those great products. After that, I was leading UX and research in different agencies in Paris, where my role was teaching people how to design and research, and then ultimately sell both these things. And so the funny story goes that I'm sure everyone in this call can relate, but selling research within agencies was probably the biggest nightmare that you could go through. It basically turned into telling your customers that you were going to spend the next 5 weeks trying to find 5 people that were willing to come to your office, spend hours in the room with them, compile a report with these 5 data points that you were able to collect, and then present all of this for the price tag of 50K, right? And so while everyone agreed we all need research, the reality of the work was that people would say, let's build instead, right? Let's design instead. So everyone knew that learning pre-development was important, but no one could really afford to make it happen. So that's when we experienced the pain of research and how research was run. But the fun story is that Maze didn't start at this point in this journey. Afterwards, we built a company with my co-founder Thomas called Ping, which was a messaging app for gamers. So literally nothing to do with what we're doing today. Mm-hmm. We were Discord right before Discord for the gamers in Discord. And the first story goes that we were backed by Fnatic, which is the biggest and largest pro gaming team in the world. And because of that backing, we had literally thousands of people in a waiting list eager to try out our product. But the reality at the time was we didn't have a product yet. What we had was a very in-depth, envisioned prototype of what we wanted to create. And so we thought, how do we get this prototype in front of the eyes of these thousands of people without having to look at individual sessions to understand which features we needed to prioritize, which design we're working, which flows we needed to build. And so looking at solutions online, what we found at the time was a lot of solutions that transposed the process that was long and expensive, which was the face-to-face interview, into processes that were long and expensive, but online, right? Video recording, all the likes. And so we hacked our way into what would become Maze, right? What we did at the time was we downloaded an envisioned prototype. We started putting analytics on top of everything with this idea that if we were able to collect data at scale, we'd be able to understand how people were behaving, which features we could prioritize with actually the data that made sense, right? Yeah. We sent out the first test, 5,000 people. We got 2.5 thousand responses in 1 hour. So I come from a world where 5 responses in 5 weeks was basically opening champagne. And all of a sudden we had like this treasure trove of data. And more importantly, what we had was that all of a sudden the cost of iteration and learning didn't include the cost of development. And that was mind-blowing to us, right? All of a sudden we could see what we needed to build before actually building it. I'll do the long story short because I'm conscious of everyone's time in Discord, but Discord arrived on the market and became the fastest growing company in 2017 and 2018, which made it very hard for us to compete against. And this idea of Maze I was obsessed with, right? I kept on thinking, this is something where I see the value, I can prove the value very easily, and we can build, right? And so I took my old job back as lead UX in different agencies, and I forced customers to try out the solution. So a fun story that I have about this is that my first customer is a big French bank with a green logo that I'm not legally allowed to name. And so this bank, they didn't want research for all the reasons I mentioned before, right? Long, expensive. They didn't care about the 5 data points. And I told them, we have this new platform, and it allows us to go from the prototype that we've already created to having actionable data before we actually go and build the thing. The customer said, okay, we send out the test to 50 of their customers. We got the results back after an hour. My client looks at the results at the time and went directly to my boss and said, if this was available last year, we could literally have saved millions of dollars in development. And so that started shaping the value of what we are really building. The testing and the research, all of these are tools, right? The reality was it was a rethinking of the product development process. How can we help democratize research for everyone? And so that's how we got started with this crazy journey of creating Maze now 3.5 years ago of democratization of research for companies of all sizes. We sell to small startups such as we sell to IBM and SAP, to every industry, meaning that we believe that anyone that has digital assets should be able to test those assets. So we count in our customers the likes of Walmart and Porsche. And more importantly, and that's why we're having this chat today, to everyone, which means that our core belief is that research is a muscle that should happen everywhere within the org, meaning that it should be run by product managers, product designers, product marketers, really everyone. And yeah, I'm happy to talk about it today and explain how we can make it happen.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really great. That's a great story. I mean, I love the success of those kinds of things, those aha moments, as you could say, in product, where it's like, wow, we've really like locked into something here that's a core problem, and really to be able to bring that to life and solve for that is fantastic. I know, like, you as a founder, you're active in talking with lots of different companies, building lots of different products. Might be building, as you mentioned, in lots of different sectors and spaces, from banking to whatever. Lots of different places in which they could be doing that work. But what are some of the current challenges that you see in different product organizations that you talk with regards to research and learning in general?
So I think there's 2 main ones. The first one is about perception bias. I think that for a long time, research has been very mentally loaded, which is what I touched on very early on, right? Which is it's still perceived as a long, expensive activity, right? It's still perceived as something that requires a lot of investment. Very often I hear, but we don't have a lab, but we don't know how to record. Like all of this, perception of complexity that surrounds research, when the reality is talking to a user in a call is research, right? Like that's the reality of what it is. It's any element that helps you make a decision is research, right? It's just a tool. So I think this is the first one. And then this has a trickle-down effect, which is the buy-in that you get with new organization, right? Because there's this perception from the people that are actually doing the job, then the perception goes up to the CEO, the VP level, where it's also perceived like that. So you need to get the buy-in and explain to people why it's important to learn within an organization. So I think those are the 2 main challenges that we see, right? It's getting started doing it, and then selling it internally are the 2 things that we see the most of.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking back even to my own user experience career in the past. It's like, it seems like that's exactly the same problem everyone's still dealing with 20 years later, which is kind of hilarious. I guess in some ways, maybe sad too, in some ways, but I guess what I'm curious is like, how have you found maybe ways in which to help teams through those conversations, get them over those hurdles on those 2 particular challenges?
Yeah. I think the first thing is what I just mentioned, which is just getting started doing it, right? So generally, what we see in organizations is that you would have a designer, you would have a product manager that really wants to start embedding more research into their process, but they think we don't have a user researcher. We don't have someone that's dedicated to do it. And the reality is you have the means to make the change happen within the organization. I think that people see the 0 to 1 journey as something that needs to be a revolution, when in reality, it's really an evolution, right? It's we do nothing, we do something, and actually doing something will build the muscle in the end, right? So what we see a lot, what we advocate for a lot is just start doing the work yourself, right? Just start talking to users, start proving that there's value in talking to users, start creating empathy with your users, and then showcase that to the rest of your team. And then your team will showcase that to the rest of their teams. And then at the end of the journey, you will actually start building the learning and research muscle within your org.
Yeah, and it's really that inertia, like getting that flywheel spinning, right? It's just sometimes it's the baby steps that you need to get the wheel moving.
Exactly. And I think the second thing is about trying to back it with concrete data, right? I think that people are very sensitive both to the empathy side of things, that's the more empathetic side of us that's talking, and then the more data-driven side of us, right? Which is, what is the ROI of actually running these activities? How should I think about this being a success, right? And I think so on our end, obviously, we write a lot about how you need to think about the ROI of research. And I think that for us, what we've seen a lot of is it's about showcasing how not doing research is expensive, right? I think that it's putting the problem on its head, where we say often, right? If you think that running research is expensive, try not running research. And so the reality of it is, it comes down to not running research really means that there's this great article that shows that it's 100 times more expensive to actually fail post-development than it is to fail pre-development. And that's not just the cost of development, right? That's one cost, but it's also the cost of support for supporting a broken product. It's the cost of the brain damage that you'll have for presenting to your customers for customer experience. That's the cost of business loss from building flows that are not working. So all of these baked in actually have a much higher cost than actually running the research earlier on. So being able to build empathy by talking to users and showcasing the strong, like, this doesn't work. And then on the other end of the journey, showing like, actually, we're losing money not doing that, right? So that's how we help companies actually get there.
Yeah, that's great. That's fantastic. So, like, why is learning as an organization important? And I want to stress maybe the organization part of that, because obviously we sometimes learn as individual people, like product managers, UX designers, UX researchers, but we don't really learn as a company and organization. So why is that? Why was that change and really integral? I know it's a key message that you like to convey as part of the work that you do.
So I'll start very high level, and then we can get down to the business economics, the economics. On the way that we structure it on R&D, tomorrow will be winners and losers. It is that the one that are able to conceive and create with their customers. What that really means is that product and product development, and actually product excellence, is no longer nice to have. It's something that every company is competing on, right? We see now companies emerge where the only differentiation is really the quality of the product that they build and the capacity as an organization. So that trickles down to the number they just shared, right? The 100x more expensive to actually learn post development. But it all trickles down to a great article that McKinsey actually wrote 2 years ago called The Business Value of Design. And what McKinsey did 2 years ago was they analyzed the Fortune 500 companies, and they indexed the level of design within the organization. They said, you're a great design organization, you're a bad design organization. And they look at the return from those investments. And what they really proved was companies that invest in design have 2x the return of companies that don't. That's a very simple metric that you can base off of. And so what happens with that number, very simple, is that you see two shifts. On one end, you see the ratio of design, dev, and research shrink, right? You see this ratio shrink through the years. So you have the new companies like the Uber, the Intercom, that have a famously 1-to-5 ratio between design and dev. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the old guard. You have the IBM and you have the Atlassian that have to catch up, right? And so IBM, for example, went from 1-to-72 design to dev ratio to 1-to-5 in the span of 5 years, right? Just to be able to catch up. Yep. What that really proved, a proven strategy makes sense. That's how we frame it for our users and our user management, so that they can actually.
Look, we're having a little bit of audio challenges. We'll see if we can catch that up there. It looks like you're coming back in, so that's okay. I think we're fine now. The joys of Zoom.
Yeah, that's fine. Let me know if I'm breaking again. I'm happy to repeat whatever I'm saying.
Yeah, I think most of what we caught there was, like, obviously, like, there's a big ROI difference here between essentially the value of an organization that has design and has design practices versus an organization that doesn't, and that your organization can change. You can affect change in how your organization is set up and working. You can be, you move from, like, I think you mentioned, like a 72-to-1 kind of ratio to a 5-to-1 kind of ratio with effort, with focus. But also it sounds like having that, like, data backed experience, that sort of, traction of someone leaning in and trying this is really an integral part of shifting that culture, if I'm understanding it correctly.
Exactly. It's very rare that we see an organization that this change will happen top down. What we see a lot is this change actually happening bottoms up, right? Where we see the designers, the product managers actually starting doing the work. And that's what put the wheels in motion, right? Rather than a new VP of design coming in and saying, we're going to be more research driven, right? That's not really how these things happen. The buy-in needs to start from the people that are actually going to do the work, right?
Yeah. Baby steps. That's great.
Baby steps, exactly.
There's been a shift in the role of the researcher, from what I might describe as, like, operational, like running research, to educational, kind of educating the product team to do their own research. And I know we've seen that even in our own team. Like we have a user researcher, and she's really empowering the entire organization and entire team to do their work better and more effectively. What caused this to kind of happen? And how do you see this kind of maybe reimagining the role, benefiting particularly product teams on that side?
Yeah, so I'll use a lot of analogy in this call, so apologies for everyone that hates analogy. It's going to be an analytical conversation. No, so I think the way to think about it is it's very similar to what happened with data 10 years ago. I think that what's interesting here is when you think about data, data is a decision tool. Research is a decision tool. Both are very, very similar in also the way they were structured with an organization, right? For a long time, data was a small siloed part of the organization. That was the BI team, right? I remember a conversation where it's going to be a long one, but where I talked to a team that was just two people called like Bridget and Evan. And so they were the BI team because it was B and I, the initial. But yeah, so small siloed part of the organization. And what happened was data needed to happen everywhere, right? And so what you've seen in the past is platforms like Amplitude, platforms like Mixpanel, and what they really achieved these platforms is making data self-serve so that data could become a conversation everywhere within the org. And I think that when you look at the state of research today, research is still a small siloed part of the organization. We talk to our customers. I had a conversation with Google Flight lead researcher two weeks ago, and the conversation was about how can I not be a bottleneck within the org, right? I'm a single person. Meanwhile, we have 50 people product team just for this simple product, right? So we have 50x the means to build as we have the means to learn as an organization. How can I help? There's two solutions, right? A, you hire a massive research team, or B, you actually empower the people that have to make decisions to make those decisions. And historically, when we look at data, that's exactly what has happened, right? Tools emerged, allowing everyone to have data conversation. And BI and data are kind of the gatekeepers of how do we prune data, how do we think about data, how to ask the right question about data. Research is the same thing, right? Research is the researcher's role needs to be today that they focus entirely on empowering their team to run their own research and to unblock decisions, right? If a product manager has to make 7 decisions a day, how many researchers will you need to run actually this job versus teaching the product manager to run their decision themselves? So I think that's why we're seeing this role shift. And one of our advisors is Bezat Sirziani, who was the lead researcher at Slack and Facebook. And that was his entire role. He joined as an operator. And later on, his role shifted entirely to creating databases of questions on how to ask the right questions to your customers, reviewing the data with the product managers and the designers and making sense of this data with them. So it's, to me, it's the same journey than the data has been through.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so like for people that are kind of stuck in this mode, like I am maybe a researcher who is in this operational chair and I want to pivot to kind of this educational kind of lens, how do I do that? Like, how do I start making that shift? How do I start making that change?
Yeah. So what we see a lot of is reassessing which decision is to be made by who, right? And to do that, what we like to use is the 4 risk framework, where we say, okay, so there's business risk, value risk, usability risk, feasibility risk, right? Historically, researchers have had to cover pretty much everything, right? All of these risks were emerged from all of these roles, but the reality is that researchers were the ones that were actually de-risking these decisions. For us, what we see is the business risk is something that's owned by the researcher. Finding out if there's a market for a problem or a problem that we need to solve as an organization, that comes from the qualitative data and the qualitative conversation that they will have. The second part of the journey is owned by the product managers, the value risk, right? Now that we've identified that there's a market we need to build against, which solution do we need to build, right? And so the role of the researcher then is helping the product managers getting to these decisions. So giving them the tools, giving them the question framework so that they can actually unlock themselves in these decisions. Then it's like a relay race, right? Then it's passed down to the designers, and the designers will have to build the solution. So how do you help them unlock the usability part of the risk, right? Same thing, you give them the tool, you give them the question framework, you give them everything to compile the data and make sense of them. And finally, the feasibility, which is less of the researcher. So it's really about putting the researcher at every step of this journey, sometimes as operator for the very early stage of the journey, which is really what they like to do as well, right? It's the role of the researcher is to identify markets and then empowering the rest of the team through tools and frameworks.
Yeah, that's a great lens. I love the cadence against the 4 risks that Kagan often talks about. I think it's a good lens to think about it. I've often thought too of like maybe Kagan talks about this common sort of triad of product manager, designer, engineer. But I think always like what I've always had is a bit more of a 4-legged stool with the user researcher, almost maybe even sometimes a 5-legged stool with a product analyst and maybe other roles that were kind of supporting that piece. And so the more we can sort of involve people in that, the better product we essentially, in the end kind of build. I'm going to pivot over to another question here. Like user research has always been a really big input into understanding customer needs. We value and really think that's quite important. How do you think researchers can better impact and influence decisions that product managers need to make about their products? And what principles should guide their collaboration and work together?
Yeah, I think it kind of goes back to what we just discussed as well, which is identifying with them which exact risk we're trying to write. That the problem with research today is that research is still perceived as an activity rather than a making tool. So the reality of the product manager's role right now is how can I identify which features I need to build? Can you hear me properly? I see my internet connection is stable again.
You came in for stable at the moment. It's okay, you're good.
Cool. So how can I help them unlock the discovery part of the journey, right? And so the role of the researcher is, in my opinion, helping them create a narrative and a story with both the data that the product manager will be able to collect and enforced by also the data that the researcher has been compiling on this specific topic. So proving the problem is here and proving the solution is the right response to the problem. And so their collaboration is less about, working together in a Figma file and trying to create something. And it's more about creating a narrative and a story that they can sell to the next step of the journey, right? And I think that's when we see research really embedded inside product teams, what we really see is kind of it's kind of a beautiful story that's being crafted together, right? This is researcher showcasing there's a problem. This is product manager showcasing the solution with the help of the researcher. This is designer showcasing how the solution should be built. This is product marketer showcasing how the value proposition has been tested and proved. And so all of this just creates also a system of record inside the organization where the more you do it, the better the documentation on your product is, and the better you're also able to track which decision has been made and why. That's how you collaborate with research.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's a great lens. I'm going to think a little bit here about like the size of teams and some of the challenges that teams kind of run into. I know like a lot of product teams are pretty skinny and kind of what I want to describe as like thin on people. It's not uncommon to see, say, for example, 1 to 3 PMs in a 100-person company, and maybe even design or user research shared across teams or even non-existent in some cases. For those like without a dedicated research role, without someone to kind of like maybe be that educator, how can they best get started? And I know, again, maybe this comes back to your original answer there of, well, you just need to start doing it. But maybe I'm curious, like maybe for that PM that doesn't have this team, doesn't have that supporting thought, knowledge, and kind of leadership on that side, how they can get moving, and then likely as well, how they can advocate for investment into that particular role. Because there's actually value in a user research role being part of a product org, but often it's like it's the last hire. It's the, later on down the line, or, that kind of thing.
We have this joke at Maze that research is the gym of the product team. It's something that everyone says they'll do on January 1st and drop on January 31. And so it's definitely a challenge, especially as you said, like InVision had a great document called the design maturity model, where they showed like there's roughly 5 levels of maturity within an organization. And level 1, which is design, and design is mockup, right? Still represents 50% of companies today, right? Meanwhile, level 5, which is design and research is a business investment, is roughly 2% of the total number of organizations. So if you're in this call, you're most likely in the first part of the journey than you are in if everyone here is level 5, great for all of you. But yeah, the reality is that most companies don't have this level of investment today. So when this happens, which is 80% of our customers and our users, right? It's this level 1 as well. When this happens, what's really, really powerful is, again, for you to start running your research on your own. So basically trying to be as precise about what you're trying to learn. So talking to users, forcing conversation with users, creating empathy is the first step. So trying to compile the point of frustration and the point of knowledge that you've accumulated through your own research process. And then showcasing how this translated into concrete actions as well, right? People are, if you're working with people that are rational, the reality is this is enough to showcase the value of what you're doing, right? This is the challenge that we were facing. this is how we tackle the challenge by talking to some users. And these are the actions that we've taken. And that starts proving that there's value in actually running the research. And again, it's all about building this muscle. I'll say that a million times if needed throughout this call, because I think that the key takeaway from this conversation should be that wherever you are in this journey, you can get started, right? You can get started with building the muscle. That you shouldn't think that you're stopped by tooling, processes, means, or investment, right? Talking to a user is user research.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really great point. How are product and user researchers kind of reorganizing or reshaping their teams to kind of support more collaboration and work together? Like, what are you seeing out there that's kind of coming together, and particularly like maybe what is a, like maybe I'll go back to that triad I was talking about earlier. Like, what does an ideal configuration and kind of setup look like if we had to kind of like wipe the slate clean and maybe the patterns we've had to date and really establish essentially a better way of working together and collaborating together? What does that maybe look like?
So I think there's no one size fits all. So it's going to be a different answer for every company. The reality for me is, just like data, it really depends on the level of maturity of your organization. So when you're small and nimble and you're a startup and you're below 50 people and everyone does pretty much everything, the setup should be pretty simple, right? Everyone should be thinking about research and everyone should be communicating with their users. So then at the stage of the company, that's where the research chaos is acceptable, right? One of our advisors is Elena Werner, who was the SVP growth at SurveyMonkey and the CMO at Miro and a bunch of other company. And what she says is there's kind of this shift as your company matures where you have to go from chaos to dictatorship to chaos again, but a more structured chaos. So very early on, it's entirely acceptable for your company, for everyone to run research and talk to users. Because at this stage, really what you're trying to get at is how fast can we get to a decision and how much can we de-risk this decision, right? So if it means talking to 10 users, that's good enough for you to be able to move forward. Speed is really what matters. When you start maturing, people will overemphasize process. So what we see is a researcher will come in and the researcher will become the gatekeeper, right? They will want to own the process, the conversation, everything. And that's not a bad thing, right? It's like when you hire your first BI and data dictatorship starts to happen. Now, not everyone can actually produce reports. I'll be the one producing the reports. You can tell me what you need to do, right? The maturity needs to evolve. As your company starts to mature and as research starts to evolve within the organization and grow, what we see is research start building out the templates, the framework, the database of questions that everyone is embedded and can actually, again, ask questions like we were doing when we were a company below 50 people. And that's when the real collaboration happened, right? Like that's at this level of maturity that collaboration actually starts happening the most.
Yeah, that's great. Do you see like any additional roles come into this function? Like, again, I'm thinking like the traditional ones of product manager, designer, engineer, or user researcher, obviously being the additional one in that, but are you starting to see any patterns emerging in terms of like other roles that are being brought into that relationship and adding more value to either the user researcher or to the product team?
Two roles that we didn't expect were the product marketers. So a lot of product marketers start being involved more and more in the research. So a fun story as well is one of our customers is Dr. Liv, which is a big French unicorn in the healthcare space. And what they do is they test every value proposition with the Maze platform. So our customer there is actually the product marketing department. And that's interesting, right? Because historically, value proposition has been something that has been very much act of faith type of investment, right? We push it live, we see the impact of it pushing it live, and then we adapt. And so product marketing is something that's been evolving a lot. And then sales as well has been more and more involved. And that makes sense, right? When you think about it, sales and customer success are the eyes of your company, right? They are the ones that are constantly talking to your customers and learning about your customer pain. So what we see a lot is for them to be also embedded in the research process. So even us at Maze, what we do is we use the sales team to actually ask some questions for our enterprise customers. So they're not the researchers, but they act as a proxy researcher for the enterprise segment of research. So yeah, those two have been more and more embedded in the process.
Okay. And I'm going to tag on someone's question that they had asked during this, like really quickly, but it was like, what about business analysts? Like, do you see them show up maybe as part of this process?
I think we've seen them show up more of the crafting story side of things, where it's like the product manager will say, okay, so we have research showcasing that there's a real need for a solution in this space. This is what we think about in terms of solution, and this is the data from the product that's backing up what we are doing, right? So it's the collaboration happens then just on the let's say story crafting side of things.
Yeah. Okay. That's where you kind of see it showing up. That's interesting. So product teams are often dealing with two types of insights, qualitative and quantitative. Tell us a little bit about your product. I'm going to give you a little bit of opportunity to talk about your product, but how Maze really helps product teams collect this data and make better decisions.
Yeah. So I'll start by saying that those data are necessary to make a great decision. So the reality is, historically, it's a funny story. Historically, because there was no tool available to actually get this quantitative data at the research phase, people have relied very heavily on the qualitative data, right? There's this myth floating around you need 5 people to make a great decision. That's obviously false and been debunked a billion times at this point. But we moved from everything qualitative to everything quantitative, which we called the data-driven teams, right? And now we are moving away from that to a data-informed team. And what data-informed really means is you take insights from both the qualitative and the quantitative data. And I think both tools have different means. The qualitative data help you generate hypotheses. I talk to users, I go into conversation that will have different trees of possibilities. And from here, I'll be able to generate hypotheses. The validation needs to be quantitative. You would not validate things with 5 of your friends, right? You need actually a subset of people to be able to say, this is actually working. At Maze, what we do is really, historically, we've provided the quantitative layer to every part of the product development journey. So I'm a PM and I want to validate that the solution I'm building is the right one. Sure, we have tree testing and card sorting and all the things that will allow you to actually validate that at scale. You're a designer and you want to validate that your prototype is actually working and people understand your flows and the copy that you've added. We have a product for that as well, right? And all of this we compile into a report that's digestible. What we try to drive as a product is what we call time to decision. How can we get to a decision in less than 3 hours? That's really what we're trying to drive as a product. And to make that happen, we do 3 main things. The first one is we give you templates. So even if you're a non-researcher, or as we said, you don't have research embedded inside your org, you can actually get started very easily. We give you access to great questions that were created by great companies that have the resources you don't have today. Then from here, a test is very easy to be taken by your users. We generate a simple link that you can share with your users. So there's no third-party apps, no plugin, nothing to install for your users. And at the end of this journey, we compile a report for you. So we turn data into insights. We make sense of all of these so that even if you're a non-researcher, it's very easy for you to consume and make this decision. That's really what we provide for teams. So
that's super helpful.
Yeah. We do both, use the qualitative data to generate hypotheses, use the quantitative data to validate that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. The data-informed pattern, I think, is definitely one emerging and one we put some investment into recently as well in terms of our product with some integrations with the Amplitude and Mixpanel. Looking forward to seeing opportunities that we can get maybe to work together as well on that side. Lastly, I want to jump in with what do you see as kind of like the future of research? Like, how do you envision products being built in the future? And if you had to kind of like paint maybe a blue sky vision of like where this is all going, what would it look like?
A very small question. No, so the way we frame our vision that I think is shared by a lot of people in the space right now is I think that companies of tomorrow will blur the line between their users and what they're building, right? I think that's the reality of where we headed. We went from a product development perspective, we went from waterfall, which was really 6 months to learn, right? To lean and agile, which was really a month to learn, to now a new step in the process, which is how can we test every deliverable in the product development process? How can I test a feature? How can I test copy? How can I test a design? How can I test every part of the product development process? So the vision for us is that research will remain as it is today, as in still small teams that will help educate organization in running more research, but everyone will be running research, and more importantly, users will be more and more embedded in the company, right? What we see at Maze is more and more companies investing in their users, right? We see customer option pool. We see a lot of things happening in the connection between companies and their users. I think that's where research is really headed.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, like, obviously the best products we build are the ones that are closest to our customers, and the ones where we can co-involve them or co-design together or co-learn together, whatever it might be, I think is obviously the work that we do the best work on. So that's great to hear.
I'll end on the way that we frame our vision internally, and what we say at the beginning of every meeting is we want to live in a world where experiences are shaped by the people that interact with them, right? And I think that's the reality of where we want to see headed, right? It's people shaping products they use. I think that's the beauty of the journey.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks. That's a great conversation and great chat. I'm gonna open it up for Q&A again, like questions that the audience may have. You can utilize the Q&A section there. In the meantime, maybe I'm gonna get started maybe with one just while we kind of bridge to see if we have any questions here on that side. But do you think like design roles like user experience research, UX, product design should maybe be focused on a particular portion of the design process? Or is this more that like folks can span and lean in kind of like in a generalist way and also wear that specialist hat?
I think, again, so there won't be a one-size-fits-all answer. I think it's very dependent on the stage of maturity of your organization. Mm-hmm. What we like to say is that at the beginning of the journey, when you're below 100 people organization, the chaos is actually a needed part of the journey, right? What this really means is that you look at your whole funnel. How do we acquire user? How do we activate user? What is good design, etc. And all of these are owned by everyone, right? Everyone kind of owned activation. And that's a good thing, right? Everyone needs to be embedded into every part of the process. As your company mature, I think it makes sense to want to add a bit more structure in the roles and how roles are overlapping. But keep the chaos for as long as you can, because the reality is that this is the most productive part of your company, probably. So I think it's very much right to have everyone overstepping their boundaries.
Yeah, I love that idea. Keep the chaos. I'm going to put that on a shirt, I think. a good saying to kind of remind people of all of this.
Chaos-driven company.
Yeah, chaos-driven company. I think that's really good and kind of interesting. We got one question here I can see so far coming in. What are your recommendations for involving users more in the B2B SaaS space? I'm thinking beyond surveys or cold emailing.
Yeah. So I think it's extremely important. So what I do is I try to do one customer call every week, even myself. I think it's extremely important to keep yourself also grounded to your users and for your team to do as well, right? It's I think it's extremely important. So let me rephrase all of that. I think what's important is that internally inside the company, what happens is that you tell a story to yourself and to your team and to everyone, right? That's the story of your vision that you're trying to build. But this vision is not necessarily grounded in reality, right? What this means is that you need to, just like you test the product market fit, you need to have a vision market fit, right? You need to actually test this vision with your users and understand, does this vision actually make sense? Are we ahead of the market in what we are actually trying to achieve versus what people actually need today? So yeah, especially in B2B SaaS, it's crucial that you have this conversation with your users.
Yeah. So like maybe like I think maybe what this question is trying to get at too is like how can I just get them more involved? Like how can I bridge that gap between them being like maybe distant a little bit from the work that we do to actually being like really maybe engaged and wanting to participate and us being able to support them on that side?
That's a good question. I
guess I'm interpreting this, of course, but just I'm thinking that's maybe what they might be looking for a little bit more as far as
I think so. It's about identifying the people that are responsive to the means that you're already using. So if you're already using surveys, etc., trying to find the people that are already very responsive and trying to create connection with them, meaning actually doing the outreach and asking for them to jump on call. Creating this cadence of going on calls with your users and the ones that are the most engaged is a good step into creating this connection with your users. Even if it just means getting some qualitative data out of the journey of creating your product. I think what we've seen happen as well is for people to create this kind of, let's say, customer advisory board. So basically finding out who are the top users, the more responsive users, the ones that represent the ideal customer profile of your company, and trying to engage as much as possible. At Maze, we also have our community. And what we do is we do special events for this specific group of people where we expose the new features, we present them with new features, we get the feedback from them. So ritualizing, talking to your users, creating a customer advisory board, and then on your end, doing these one-on-ones pretty regularly so you create this cadence of talking to users.
Yeah. I think you talked earlier too, or touched on one of your answers there of like the ability to involve other teams in helping you get to this data is a really important part too, like bridging into your sales organization and saying, hey, are there some customers you're talking with or people that you're talking with recently or your CS team, like leveraging the rest of your organization and helping you find and identify these people is a really important bridging step that we need to take as product managers. Yeah,
absolutely. That's a very good one.
no, that's cool. That's great. I don't have any other questions at the moment here, so I'm just going to bring in a couple other ones maybe that I've got on this side. And I see often in organizations that people kind of struggle with the need for kind of what I might describe as like constant discovery, and really the sense of like when have we done enough discovery, and how can really product teams like determine when it's best, when's like the best time to kind of move forward into exploring solutions, or further doing, like kind of ending that, essentially that discovery activity, feeling like we're done.
Yeah, it's super hard. We've seen so many cases of analysis paralysis, right? Where you're at the stage where it's when do we have enough data to be able to move on? When do we know that we're actually de-risked enough? It's a bit of the same of what I said earlier regarding the stage at maturity of your company. I think that the more you mature, the more you want to actually be able to de-risk and have the data to support your claim, especially as investment in building things will cost more and more as an organization. Earlier on, what you really want is any level of de-risking, right? Any level of discovery. I think that putting timelines on your discovery, so treating it just like any other backlog, right? Discovery will end on this date, and that's enough for us to move forward and to commit to something. And then trying to also quantify what you're trying to get at with this decision, right? So what we do, for example, at Maze is whenever we have a decision to make on the discovery side, we'll send out surveys and we'll say, this is the threshold at which we're okay with moving forward, and that's an okay level of risk that we're willing to take, right? So for example, we ask people, if we were to build XYZ, would you actually use this feature, right? We'll regroup those into different subset of our customers, and we'll say, this customer set seems to be very on board with this feature. Let's try to build it for them and see if that's actually working. If we don't get to the threshold, then it can be an indicator that we don't need to build the feature or de-risk the feature. So that's when we kill discovery.
Yeah, that's a great lens to take on that. Really appreciate that answer. I think that's kind of it. I don't see any other questions coming in. I really want to thank you, Joe. It's been great talking with you. I know we had a little bit of internet hiccups there in Barcelona, but not the end of the world. I know we'll get through it, and we're all fine on that side. Again, encourage people to share any questions you've got about Joe's session with us. I know Joe would be happy to jump in and answer those after the event as well. He's pretty engaged and awesome on this side. So
yeah, feel free to add me wherever, Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever works. I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Happy to chat as well. Always happy to talk to product people and great products. So yeah, feel free to reach out.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thanks very much. I'm going to wrap up here on today's session. Sorry, just 2 seconds here, not quite working. There we go. So just as a reminder for everybody, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this particular event. You will get a survey as well over the messaging post-event. I'll just pop a link as well here in the chat in case you want to grab it or fill it out beforehand. We'd always love the feedback, and Joe would love to hear a little bit of your thoughts too on what you thought of today's conversation. As I mentioned as well, you're more than welcome to continue the discussion within our own community here at Product Makers. Create a post, share your comments, ask a question post-event, and we'll be happy to direct those over to Joe to answer or respond to on that side. As well, we've got some additional events coming up. Next week, we're meeting with Rachel Brown, Sam as well from our community here. They're going to be doing a little fireside chat on navigating your career in product. We've got an event as well on the 24th with Jeremy and Chris, our product managers from Productboard and Amplitude. We'll be peeling back the layers a little bit on the work they recently did on this integration between Amplitude and Productboard, and give us a little bit behind the scenes of the maybe challenges and mess and steps that they had to kind of take in considerations along the way of building that integration out. And then we've also got an event scheduled right now as well with Ian Ames in April for product prioritization. He's going to be teaching us a little bit about prioritization in the context of search and rescue, which will be kind of interesting parallelism on that side. Lots of other ways to get involved here in the community as well, whether it be roundtables, which we do the second Wednesday sort of each month. Our Be to Maker program, where you can connect one-to-one with people that are part of our community. And also, again, always interested in hearing from other speakers. So if you're interested in maybe sharing some of your knowledge, like Joe did for us today, feel free to lean in and let us know on that side. Again, thank you for joining, everybody. I really appreciate you having me here. And Joe, again, thanks for the wisdom and great knowledge to share today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. And thanks for having me today.
No problem.
Yeah, very cool chat. Thanks, everyone.